Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Communion and Shalom. This is TJ, and we're, of course, joined by...
I'm here too. This is David.
And we also have our friend Elena here with us.
Hello.
You've heard from her previously in a previous podcast, but we wanted to invite her back to share her insights and wisdom on this topic. So we're coming back.
Overselling it, but here we are.
We're happy you're here. So we're going to come back to talk about another round about pride.
Yes, so we had our little porch podcast talking about Pride Month, and we've been having more discussion and reading and learning, considering different perspectives.
And many of those perspectives have been negative ones, which are more skeptical of pride. This includes people in our churches, but also various authors or writers who are writing about it in this particular time of Pride 2022. Maybe I'll let David Frank start.
So to introduce a little bit more of our conversation, last time, I think as we were talking about Pride Month, I was really trying to emphasize how we can approach this more charitably, especially in our personal relationships and just as persons on the street, in neighborhoods, in relationships. What does it look like to, come at this with Christian love?
Mm-hmm.
And I came across this quote in this book by Kyle David Bennett called Practices of Love. It's about spiritual disciplines for the life of the world. And he quotes right at the beginning from Soren Kierkegaard. And I think this captures a lot of just my heart. Here's the quote. When one has fully entered the realm of love, the world, no matter how imperfect, becomes rich and beautiful. It consists solely of opportunities for love. And in its imperfection, it's just that we're so, where I'm trying to open myself up for God to keep growing me and leading me is to be looking at the imperfections of, let's say, Pride culture, Pride events in my city, and thinking not just what's the stone I can throw, but what's my opportunity for love? So that's my conviction a lot.
Yeah.
That I'm coming to this with, that I'm just really disappointed when I see Christian writers that could be basically if they were a conservative, moral Muslim, that their writing would look probably no different, or a Jewish person who hold, conservative views of morality, or an atheist who just had conservative ethics for sexual, their piece would look no different. Just maybe use a few, Christian signaling words or something. But the posture behind the piece doesn't actually feel Christian. And so I don't.
By which you mean loving.
And I hope people can understand, especially in the midst of everything we've podcasted about, that this isn't, I don't mean cheap love of just affirm. You just never say bad things about people. There may be in my own personality, ways that I don't know, am too soft on people at times or something, but some tough love is included in that or whatever, telling the truth. And that's largely what we want to talk about today is if we start with the assumption of we are moving in a way of love, whether you are, part of the LGBT community or, adjacent to it, ally, or however you want to just say a neighbor who's trying to move in with love, that doesn't mean there aren't serious things to critique. And so I hope the first episode is showing that posture of reaching out, of not waiting for people to come to your standards for us to have to engage in this or something, but that you can really be charitable in how you approach things.
Yeah. A lot of we mentioned this in the previous podcast, the current critiques we're reading, such as by Orthodox journalist Rod Dreher or Reformed theologian Carl Trueman, or other people in our churches who are sending us these articles, they generally are critiquing kind of the way that pride is now like the high holy day of contemporary secular Western culture. And of course, any cultural community, the way it structures space and time shows what they are important to them. And obviously, the contemporary US is not structuring it very strongly around the Christian calendar, even though Christian holidays like Easter and Christmas are secularized in this context. So they still play a role, but there's not a formal celebration of Lent or Pentecost or anything like that. Additionally, there's the critique of the civilizational kind of logic that these pride events, they rely on certain ideas of desire, which are closer to like desire and authenticity, to pursue what you see as the good, what you want, with few transcendental norms or ways of thinking about the world. And that's a very legitimate critique. They didn't go very far because occasionally they bring in capitalism. Rod Dreher does. Carl Trueman, I don't remember his article if he brought it in, but I don't think he did. But I don't know, they're operating on critiques that Christians should care about. And we should care about these civilizational structural critiques because they actually are important. And Christianity is meant to be it's supposed to have a public force. Like it's not meant to be just your own interiority, private, I love Jesus exclusively. But it's meant to have social, political importance because of course we're citizens of a kingdom. We follow the King of Kings who is initiating his whole reign across the whole world in one way or another. And there's a lot to say there. Different theologies configure that in different ways, what that means as we engage in the secular age. But there's still an important critique that should be offered. So we're kind of in the midst of, I think we wholeheartedly were on the same page in our previous podcast about the need to love of neighbor, what that means. But we also want to ensure that this critique is mentioned, but our whole point is how to bring them together because we think they're both needed. And I will say, and I think this is crucially important, these critiques don't engage side B people that I could see in any of these critiques, and they don't engage people like us who are on the borders and the boundaries, who might actually be able to see the goods in both sides and critique both sides because we're the middle. A lot of the side B people I know on online forums that we're part of, they celebrate pride in some way or another. And a big part of that seems to be, from what I can tell, is because they do agree with the idea that pride is about recognizing the dignity of queer people. And I guess some of the conservative Christian critics may not see that or may see that as so minimal. We had a mutual friend who actually said, basically, pride is just about sexual morality. There may be a kernel of goodness, but it's mostly about sexual morality. And I would just tell you, I've never been to Pride, as I said. David Frank has. But a lot of queer people don't see it as just about sexual morality, for better or for worse. So,
and a lot of people engage with pride things, mainly the rainbow flag we can think about is probably the most prominent, thing that like you see that rainbow flag, you're like, oh, pride, and that culture exists outside of Pride Month and any pride specific events.
Sure.
I'm guessing like a ton of people have not been to pride events. I've never been to a pride march. I've, seen pictures now of like San Francisco Pride March and, I can understand. There's this one blogger who's like, everyone should go like at least once just to understand. And that's kind of what I was encouraging to like, just at least try to understand your neighbors. Like you don't have to go to like participate or celebrate, but there's something to witnessing.
Yeah.
But yeah, this dialogue around different ways that people do receive what that rainbow flag means to them as a kind of piece of pride culture.
I think part of this is also the difference between like a missiological or mission-focused sensibility versus sort of a more philosophical or doctrinal sensibility, and how sometimes people who place themselves in one of those sectors or poles don't communicate well with each other.
And in some sense, there's people who are more oriented, you can even just say like, outward towards evangelism
Mhm.
versus those who are looking inward and trying to like bolster up the church in its truth and righteousness.
Yeah.
And maybe they're wanting the culture to see that or conform to that in certain ways, because it's like, if it's good, then it's good for everybody. And we don't want our culture to be, falling prey to lies and bad schemes of thinking.
Yeah.
So there's I don't dismiss those who are doing the larger cultural critique. And I don't think that, I don't assume that like Rod Dreher or Carl Trueman have bad relationships with, LGBTQ people. Rod Dreher mentions he has gay friends who are also conservative and have their critiques of Pride Month, which I totally expect. I
Sure.
expect Carl Trueman has charitable, hospitable relationships with, Christians and non-Christians who, are same-sex attracted or queer. So I just think that how we voice these things in the public online sphere is an important part of continuing to shape Christians in both upholding truth and righteousness and being very wary of the winds of worldly philosophy and how they totally blow through the culture and the church the same. Like we have fallen prey to the same lies of the sexual revolution as the rest of the world has in just kind of Christianese ways. So I just want to hold both together.
Yeah. We're gonna hold both together as well.
I hope it's possible.
Who do you see most interacting with these articles that you're referring to? Who do you think the audience is that these people are talking to? And who do you most see sort of interacting, passing it on, discussing it?
Good question. I think like Carl Trueman operates in kind of conservative reformed spheres, and like we all do, we tend to read those people that we agree with and help it, and like, and so I think that's where like it just feels a little of like, that's not the message that your audience probably needs to hear, Carl Trueman. Like the people you're speaking to, I'm sure there's people more widely who disagree with you who lead it, but you have a voice in the church of people who are already upholding good moral sexual standards. And is that maybe some of them do need to be bolstered and not getting swept away in pride hysteria. But is that kind of like, it feels like it's mostly and then probably people who are in supportive of pride, they're probably reading authors that are also in supportive of pride, like we're all stuck in our little echo chambers.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what the message is and who it's intended for and who's actually interacting with it. How far does that circle go?
I have thoughts on that. But first I want to go back to a point that was made earlier. You mentioned, David Frank, that you think these people have queer friends, which I assume they know queer people, but I don't think they're dialogue with side B people. And I will say that very explicitly. I don't think they are, because if they did, I think they'd have to actually give more credence, or at least say in some of their articles why these other perspectives are wrong, other than just not talking about it.
That's fair.
So
there's in other writings of Carl Trueman, I know that he's decidedly anti side B, and that just sees, from what I remember, that identifying in any of the kind of LGBTQ ways, he just feels is very antithetical to being a Christian.
We classify him as a side Y, in the side Y thinking school.
Yeah.
But I don't read Carl Trueman much, but I read Rod Dreher all the time. He's probably my favorite blogger, or journalist / blogger. And I would say he does not engage with side B enough, because he gets very much the culture war mode. And side B makes these things complicated. Back to Elena's question. So I'll focus on Rod Dreher in particular. I think his blog reaches out to maybe like lowercase o, meaning a lot of Christians who are somehow Orthodox Christians. I think those are his general audience. And usually it's people who are, usually they're more, you probably lean conservative, you might say, in the sense of their theological beliefs.
Mm-hmm. And Roger brings up his conservative, non-Christian gay friends,
Yeah.
who are also like kind of sick of Pride Month. And I think and this is what we wanted to talk about, like, in a sense, some of these things that we agree in their critiques.
Yeah.
Right?
I mentioned some of them.
Can we dig into them a little, open those up a little bit more and instead of just gloss it over?
Sure. So one is that the public liturgies of the U.S. society is more dominated by like pride. Like pride plays a larger role for a lot of how the U.S. society sets time than Christian sort of holidays or Christian.
But so for these like non-Christian conservative gays,
Mhm.
their critiques are not like, oh, we wish they were celebrating Christmas and Easter more. It's simply the values that are being proclaimed in these big.
That's the
pride
second
events.
critique, though, because there's at least two. So one was that I just said, like the public instantiation of the kind of the
The holiday.
spiritual holiday is not
I think
Christian.
it is funny when Roger says the high holy month of Pride.
It is funny.
Because
The second one is a critique of the.
he's kind of right.
He's kind of right. The ideas of desire that are the ideas of desire tied with kind of capitalist desire, which is all about satisfying your own interior, authentic
And as an anti-consumerist,
design.
I just totally get behind the critique, like
Mhm.
this, like, oh, whatever you love, whatever you desire, just give yourself to it. And so they point out, of course, corporations are going to get behind this. Of course, Amazon is going to be a giant supporter in whatever Pride event it can, because it's like, yeah, give yourself to your desires. Do that one-click buy. You want it, you get it. Like, you want that person, you get them, as long as there's consent. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, it's
Like, oh, this is a bad way to live.
Yeah. So I would agree with those. We both were somewhat sympathetic in our last podcast to attending Pride. But I guess I mentioned I'd never had, and I'd probably be pretty limited on events that I would attend in a general Pride month. I probably wouldn't go to a parade. This is just my own opinion.
Parades are boring. You just have to sit there.
They are boring.
Be subjected to whatever rolls past you at the exact rate through which they decide it rolls past you.
That seems right.
So judgy
Not-
on parade. Sorry.
Nice, pretty. But
But I might attend some events. But the big thing is, if a Christian attends Pride, I don't automatically think they're sinning.
yeah,
Like I don't think it's an automatic like you are automatically turned against the faith or you're participating in a non-Christian activity and you're horrible for that reason. I assume there can be more than one reason.
just like watching various movies that have a whole sort of mixed values, presented in them.
Sure.
Do you assume that everyone who watches Ocean's 11 is,
Can become a criminal? Is that what it's about?
yeah, thievery? I mean, like, I think it's a valid question to say, how is this movie forming my values? Is it making
valid
me stop on sin?
Yeah, it's a valid question. But then, as you mentioned with your love quote, when I see that, I again think of what we mentioned in the previous podcast, where we're recognizing that there's evil to some extent, but it's disordered goods. Like there's some goods they're pursuing, but they're just not ordered in the right way, basically.
I mean, because all desire is ultimately rooted in that God has created good desires in us.
Yeah, I think.
But that doesn't like Amazon and Pride events just wanting to give full reign to individual desire. And that's, it's not limited to Pride. That's just our culture, right? Like you do you, man. It's baked into just so much of how we live. Oh, you want it? Treat yourself.
But we can also recognize there's goods such as the queer community exists for a lot of historical reasons. And so people can find connection in that community in places where they may have been excluded or marginalized otherwise.
Yeah, I think we talked about that last time.
Yeah, I'm just saying, yeah, we did talk about that. And then we also mentioned the good of having resources for your community or even recognize the dignity in these people. So I'm just saying there's all those goods as well, even if a lot of them are disordered, maybe those are not disordered in the same way.
And in some sense, those I see as like other goods that have kind of like been, well, I guess disordered is there's like disfigured desires of like, oh yeah, you have a desire for sex. God created that.
So we have provided a lot of ways of personal engagement, but for these civilizational structural critiques, they think they might not like that, but they would say, in fact, what we need is to make the world more Christian and better is to change structures. And the push
could include our public liturgies.
It could include our public liturgies, yes. And it could include that. So we also have to recognize, even in our side B posture, our side B positionality, that everything we talked about is good, engaging people at Pride as a person, because that's part of Christ's mission, right? The kingdom of God is that too. But also, the kingdom of God would also be ostensibly having the nations recognize Jesus as the King of Kings and making their life in accord with that kingdom, the kingdom of God, to the extent possible on this side of the new heavens and the new earth.
Yeah, but so like Truman and Dreyer's critique of these big cultural liturgies that are happening and forming our culture in these ways that I like agree with. I just don't think it's the things that they're pointing out and critiquing. I don't think are the exclusive aspects to focus on, and that even that you can just engage personally in these ways. But then we still need a positive answer of like, how are we inviting people to retell this story?
Yeah, you were
so like, if they're trying to actually change culture, they're not going to be doing it, I think, primarily through critiquing culture. They would need to be creating new ways that would be inviting people into a different value system, a different orientation of a different way of celebrating love than merely love is love. Let's not think about it any further than a small truism.
You're right. Yeah, that's very.
And I don't think they'd disagree with me that, and they'd probably point people to. They might just orient it around, well, it's the church. It's the weekly liturgy, and we should be inviting people into that.
They might say that, but I think their big thing as of now is that they're older than us, and they see the current stage of life as a sharp decline from the better childhood in this respect, like the better age of their childhood. That's what I understand from reading, at least Fred Dreyer. So I think they see that there needs to be a culture war, and there needs to be more culture war recognition by Christians that we are a minority.
I'm tired of culture.
I mentioned in our previous podcast that a lot of these conversations depend on the structural position of the church in the society. The church is dominant and her ideals and mores are broadly dominant. This conversation is different than when we're in the minority and our beliefs and norms are not dominant. So I don't know. They're just struggling with that question as well. They also want there to be pure, as we mentioned. Pure, holy.
A potentially wrap-up question, unless you have 5 other burning things to say. If either of these authors or anyone else who shares their opinions in other written pieces we haven't mentioned was listening to this podcast, what would you want them to take away or their next step to be?
Sure. A few points I would say is, really, you need to engage side B Christians who are thinking about this in a personal and kind of public way at the same time. And who actually just because of their very position, often see both goods and ills in multiple sides of the conversation. Second, I think we really need to focus on, as we mentioned, love of neighbor. What does that mean? What could that be? And that often, culture war often does not make your neighbor think you love them very much. Even though sometimes love tells someone no, or tells someone this is the better way. And that's okay. But there's just some complexity there that needs to be hashed out and dealt with. Another thing, and this is kind of related to both of them, I think, the philosophical and the abstract are very important roles but you always also have to think about the personal and the small scale, or the less theoretical scale, and how they both interrelate at once. Those are some things I have. Any other thoughts?
I'm just thinking about, like, Carl Trueman has wonderfully historically documented the rise and triumph of the modern self, as it's kind of like how we have now come to see ourselves in whatever way we define that, as we seek personal, individual authenticity as like the center of each person's little universe. And I think that the best way to help people deconstruct that is to be recognizing in whatever language that they're kind of choosing or using, helping them just submit that to the Lordship of Christ, of helping place those things. The last note that I might say, or just to summarize what I was saying more clearly, is that people are expecting Christians to come at them with condemnation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, we just need to be speaking in a way that understands that the world expects, oftentimes hypocritical, condemnation. And if we are ignoring that and not bearing that burden, it just feels so like, I don't know what we're aiming at then if we're ignoring that. It just seems to be content self-justifying ourselves and setting up our good view of how the world is and what we wish it should be, rather than really wanting people to see Jesus for who he is and not let our words be a hindrance to that. Elena, do you have any of your own?
Just thank you both for sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you can join us again in the near future. But yeah, we appreciate all of our listeners as well. Please remember that we are interested in supporters. Interested in supporting this podcast, feel free to look on our support page, which is on Anchor.
We're specifically hoping to increase the monthly support so that we can regularly hire someone to help with the editing of the podcasts, so that we can focus on the recording without getting backlogged on the editing.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.